Well, thank you very much for that. So, I thought tonight that I would give you an overview of the conceptual geography behind 12 Rules for Life, but also behind my first book, Maps of Meaning. And I would say that I derived this conceptual geography as a consequence of what I consider to be a reasonable scientific approach, especially with regards to hypothesis generation. There's this idea that was produced among psychologists concerned with measurement back in the 1950s with the relatively awkward name of multi-method, multi-trait construct validation. Very jargony phrase, but what it means is something like this. It's not easy to establish the scientific credibility of a psychological concept. So, for example, perhaps a psychological concept might be anxiety. Now, if people talk about anxiety in their normative conversation, it's generally quite easy to understand what they mean because they don't just say anxiety and stop there. They nest the word inside a sequence of sentences and a sequence of paragraphs, and you often know the person, and so the word takes on the connotations of the entire history of your interactions, let's say. It doesn't mean that you can take the word out and assume that it represents something that constitutes a genuine category in the world. So, how do you find out if something exists independently of its verbal nexus, let's say? And the answer is, well, you try to measure it using multiple methods and then see if the methods converge. And so, for example, you might generate a number of phrases that you think are indicative of anxiety, self-report, generate a questionnaire. There's processes by which questionnaires can be validated. You might see if you can get reliable measures of anxiety from people, which means that the same people would produce the same results with the same measurement tool repeated times. And then you might want to see if that measure predicted behaviors that might be reasonably associated with anxiety, like avoidance of potentially frightening tasks. And you might do psychophysiological measurements, and you might do neurological measurements if you're sophisticated enough, and you might gather reports from other people, and then you have multiple sources of evidence, and then what you look for is convergence across the sets of evidence. And if you get convergence across those sets of evidence, then you have some reasonable grounds to believe that what you're looking at is real. Now, the other thing you have to do, that's convergent validation. The other thing you have to do is make sure that you're not just misnaming something else. So, for example, maybe it's not anxiety that you're measuring, maybe it's depression, because they're quite closely allied phenomena. And so then you have to show that this new thing that you measured is distinct from things that have already been measured in some important way that allows you to predict the world in a manner that's useful. And so you have to go through all of that in order to establish that what you've measured is the genuine article. And so that's been a well-established technique in psychometrics really for 50 years. Just as a side note, there's a questionnaire that was developed at Berkeley that assesses white privilege, and it underwent none of that validation. And the people who constructed it had no idea that those validation processes even existed. And so many of the concepts that have emerged out of the postmodern world, let's say, exist as hypothetical entities, but there's been virtually no research done whatsoever to determine whether they're valid. In the case of microaggression, some of that work's been done, and there's no evidence for the construct validity of the concept. So in any case, when I wrote Maps of Meaning, I was trying to lay out a conceptual geography. And I derived my understanding of that conceptual geography from a number of different sources. Philosophical sources, neuropsychological sources, human studies and animal studies. And of the two, the animal studies were by far the most reliable and valid. And most of what we know about brain function is actually a consequence of studies that have been done by animal experimentalists. For obvious reasons. It's much easier to do detailed studies of animals for any number of reasons. Then studies of psychoanalysis and literary analysis, and also a large body of clinical research. And so what I was looking for was patterns. If I could see a phenomenon at this level of analysis, and then at this level, and then at this level, and then at this level, and they all converged, then I assumed that there might be something there. And I was generally working contrary to the hypothesis, you know, not assuming that what I was looking for was there, but not assuming that what I thought was there, but assuming that it wasn't, and then trying to see if I could take it apart so that it would disappear, and if it wouldn't, then I would assume that it was valid. When I have my graduate students do their research, this is something really useful to know if you happen to be a budding psychological researcher. You have a data set and you'll subject it to statistical analysis. And statistical analysis is not, you can't take a data set and run it through an automated statistical process and have it spit out the results of your experiment. That's not how statistics works. It's an analytic technique, and it requires iterative thought, let's say. And the problem with that is that you can be enticed into finding what you want to find, especially if you've put a lot of work into it. You know, put a whole 2 years into an experiment and you run the statistical analysis. It's not like you're not powerfully motivated to find something that you can publish, because if you don't, well then you failed and maybe you don't graduate, and then you don't have a job, and then you starve to death on the street. And so you're powerfully motivated to find something of value, even if it's not there. And that's dangerous because, of course, then you contaminate the scientific literature, but you also might end up spending your whole career chasing something that never existed to begin with. And so that's a good thing to be terrified about, you know, because you don't want to spend your whole scientific career chasing something that doesn't exist. And so one of the things that I always recommend to my students is to do the analysis multiple ways and see if you can make it disappear. And if you can make it disappear, well then, you know, be skeptical. And then replicate. That's often useful as well if you can afford the time. It's dangerous because the probability that when you replicate your result will disappear is quite high, even if you found a valid result, because the results are often not very large, and so they tend to be unstable across data sets. In any case, I needed to start with that methodological observation. So here's the conceptual geography. So now what I think this is a description of how you think is structured, or maybe even more profoundly than that. I think it's a description of how it is that you perceive is structured. Now, here's one way of thinking about it. There is a lot of detail in the world, far more than you can possibly attend to, far more than you can possibly comprehend. And what you do when you're interacting with that world somehow is reduce all that detail to the point of your concentration, whatever that happens to be. At the moment, for the majority of you, you've reduced the complexity of this room to the set of gestures that I'm making and what I'm saying. And you're not attending to anything else. It's a very mysterious process because there's a tremendous amount that you could be attending to, not only right here in front of you now, but everything that could conceivably occupy your memory. And so if your attention lags, for example, while I'm talking, it's highly probable that other systems that are competing for your attention internally will pop up some other ideas, some fantasies, some tasks you've left undone, something that's obsessing you, and that will occupy the theater of your imagination. And so what you're doing is running the entire world through a reducing valve, really, as just like Henri Bergson suggested decades ago, and just like Aldous Huxley suggested when he wrote, for example, The Doors of Perception. And the idea that your consciousness is, in some sense, is a reducing valve, it's an awkward metaphor, but there's something about it that's very true, because you're bringing the world to a point, and the point is the point of your attention. And the point is what you point at and what you aim at, and it's also generally what you say, because you use words to describe things that you point at, vice versa. Because you use words to specify the world, right? And the world is full of aims because you're active in it. And so one way of thinking about that is that you really perceive reality as if it's a landscape. And there's a great book on that called An Ecological Approach to Visual Perception, which was a classic. It was written by a guy named J.J. Gibson back in the 1970s. I have a reading list on my website, jordanbpeterson.com, and that's one of the books. I don't agree with all of his conclusions, but, well, you never agree with all of a book's conclusions, but it's still a work of genius. And he basically made a strong case that what we see in the world aren't objects that we then attribute meaning to, but meanings directly. So, for example, imagine this stage was 10 feet high with that precipitous drop, and I walked forward to it, his hypothesis would be that what I would perceive was not a discontinuity, but a falling off place, right? So it's something with I would perceive the biological significance of the landscape directly. And it makes sense if you think about it from a biological perspective, because, it might be that you perceive the objective world and then add an overlay of meaning to it. But that's slow and cumbersome, because then you have to think. And when you approach a visual cliff, let's say, well, like, how much thinking do you want to do? You certainly don't want to be preoccupied with your thinking and walk over the cliff. And it's also the case that you can do visual cliff experiments with babies, 6 months old, and you can put a sheet of glass over a cliff, and they won't crawl over the cliff, even though the glass is there. And so they can directly perceive a falling off place, and they perceive that motivationally and emotionally before they even perceive it cognitively. And a lot of what you perceive in the world, you perceive directly with your motivational and emotional systems before you even perceive things consciously. And this is a deeper issue than you might even believe, because there are people, for example, who have a condition called blind sight, and people with blind sight say they can't see. They'll tell you that they can't see, but if you can play a game with them, you say, okay, well, you can't see. I'm going to lift up my hands one after the other, and I'll tell you when they're lifted up, and I want you to guess which hand I'm holding up. And they can guess with a surprising degree of accuracy, far above chance. And the reason for that is that your visual tracts don't only report to your conscious vision centers. So imagine that what you see out in the world, what exists out in the world, is a sequence of patterns. And some of those patterns persist, and some of those patterns we see as objects, and some of those patterns we see as falling off places or tools or obstacles, but they're patterns. Okay, and then that pattern is transformed into a pattern of light, and then that's transformed into a pattern of retinal activation, and that's transformed into a pattern of neural activation that transverses your optic nerve, and then it's distributed across your nervous system. Some of it maps right onto your spine. So there are visual reflexes that are spinal. So for example, if you're walking down, I saw this happen once, if you're walking down a pathway and you happen to catch a snake out of the corner of your eye, you'll jump up in the air. I was in California, and I was walking down a pathway by the ocean with a tall friend of mine. He was about 6'5", and his daughter, I don't remember how old she was about this tall, just about 6. And there was a rattlesnake by the side of really close to the side of the pathway. Now it was kind of torpid because it was cold, but she caught the snake out of the corner of her eyes, and she jumped right on top of her father's shoulders, which was really quite, just like a cat. When you startle a cat, it was just pang, right on top. And we actually know something about the circuitry of that sort of thing. Joseph Ledoux, who's a very good neuroscientist, has pointed out that snake detection, for example, maps directly onto emotional and motor systems, so that you jump in the air before you see the snake, because it takes like half a second to see and process the visual icon snake, and by that time, well, the snake's bitten you and you're dead. And so you've conserved the automatic preconceptual reflexes that enable you to react extraordinarily suddenly to certain ecologically prepared categories, snakes among them. Darwin actually experimented with that a little bit, because he was interested in that sort of thing, and he used to go to the museum, I don't remember which one, it might have been the Albert and Victoria Museum, if that existed when Darwin was alive, it doesn't matter. There's a glass case there with a cobra in it, and if you put your face up close to the glass, it would strike. And Darwin tried to train himself not to react when the snake struck, and found that that was absolutely impossible. And, well, because all the people who are our ancestral figures who were able to train themselves to keep their face still in front of a striking cobra ended up not reproducing. And so we're not their descendants. So, all right, so you exist in a landscape. You exist in a landscape, and it's really a landscape of meaning. And meaning is, let's call it something approximating biological significance. We could call it significance for emotion and motivational significance. And the reason for that is that the landscape that you inhabit is actually a matter of life and death. And so you directly perceive many things that are relevant to your thriving and your demise. You're probably slightly better at perceiving things that are relevant to your demise, because you can only be so fulfilled, but you can be 100% dead. And so you're tilted pretty hard towards the perception of potentially negative events, and you perceive those directly. The mapping of your eyes, for example, occurs at multiple levels of the nervous system. The people who have blind sight, their cortical visual structures are damaged by a stroke. So they have no conscious vision, but there's enough residual pattern detection left so that their eyes can map someone else's body onto their body and produce maybe emotional signals or a feeling, because you can feel with your eyes about what hand is up, left or right. And then if you show those people too, if you show them flashed faces that are emotional, fearful or angry, compared to neutral faces, and you take psychophysiological measurements simultaneously, you'll see that they'll produce an orienting reflex to the emotion-laden faces, even though they claim they can't see them. So that's just a good example of, well, how complex the visual system is, but also how much perception is more direct than we think. And it really is. So, for example, when I come over here, say, and I look at this object here, it's not a neutral object. I know what it is. It's a grippable object, and it's a container of liquid. And when I look at it, then my eyes directly activate the part of my motor cortex that would allow me to make the appropriate grip. And I can estimate the grip very accurately, because people are very good at that. And that's direct perception to grip mapping. And part of the reason that I understand what that is because it's this. And that's actually a form of imitation too, from the Piagetian perspective. Is something Jean Piaget pointed out, is that we can mold our bodies to the contours of the landscape, and that's partly how we come to understand it. And so to perceive, I don't see, cylindrical object, two-dimensional, infer 3 dimensions, and then decide that that's a water bottle. The perception is far more direct than that, and involves direct mapping onto my motor output systems, because I'm engaged in active interaction with the world. You see this sort of thing happening too with people who have a syndrome that was described by a psychiatrist, neurologist named Lermit, if I remember correctly. And he described utilization syndrome, which is a very interesting neurological syndrome. People who have prefrontal damage can't stop themselves from using objects. So for example, if they walk down a hallway and there's a door and the door's open, they'll just walk through the door. Or if you put a cup in front of them, they'll grip the cup and use it, and they can't stop themselves because they're compelled. The inhibitory capacity that the prefrontal cortex allows is being damaged, and then they're compelled by the motivational significance of the objects. So you can really think, and this is something really worth thinking about in a deep, deep way, because it does appear that rather than existing in an objective world to which we attribute meaning, we exist in a meaningful world from which we extract out the meaningless object. It's actually reversed. And that also makes sense historically, if you think about it, because obviously animals live in a landscape of biological meaning, and they don't have an objective science which strips the meaning away from the object. And we didn't have an objective science until, well, it depends on how you calculate it, but 500 years ago isn't a bad estimate. And we got along perfectly well without that. I mean, perhaps we're doing better with it. But the landscape of meaning is something that's, well, it's real. It's real. And it really makes you wonder what you mean by real, because as materialists, we're generally accustomed to assuming that the object itself is real and that the meaning that's attributed to it is some secondary phenomenon. But, it's a strange thing because your brain appears to be adapted to the landscape of meaning and not to the objective landscape where meaning is secondary. And I make that point to quite a great degree in Maps of Meaning and less so in 12 Rules, but still mention it. So one of the geographical meta descriptions, I guess, that you can use to characterize the world is that it's made out of chaos and order. And chaos, roughly speaking, is what you don't expect. And order technically is where the things that you want to have happen when you do the things you should do. That's it's a complicated description, but you think about when you feel secure, okay? So think about that as a time and a place. You feel secure. That's a place. It's an important place. It's a place of safety. Okay, so how do you know you're in a place of safety? Because you undertake an operation and the result that you want occurs. What that means is that the map that you've made of the territory fits the territory perfectly because you can predict it. And that keeps your emotions under control. That keeps your anxiety under control. People do not like it when they undertake an operation that's supposed to produce a desired outcome and something else occurs. Now, if it's minor something else, well, that might be curious and interesting. But sometimes it can be a major something else, in which case it's not the least bit pleasant. So, for example, I'll give you an example. So one time I was watching television and I saw this poor guy. He must have arranged with the TV network to ask his girlfriend to marry him in front of a whole stadium full of people. And so they zoomed the camera in. They had the big jumbo camera, and he went down on his knees and asked her to marry him, and she just got up and burst into tears and ran away. It's like, for a while there, he was in order, But all of a sudden, his whole world was turned upside down because everything that he'd presumed about that situation was deeply wrong. And you think about how deeply wrong that was. I mean, he wasn't as smart as he thought he was. That's for sure. He wasn't as desirable as he thought he was, right? She didn't think he was as desirable as he thought she thought he was. He thought he was going to marry some person and have a particular future as a consequence. That was wrong. His understanding of that particular woman was so flawed that it would be reasonable for him to wonder about his understanding of women in general, right? And that might lead him to wonder whether he knows anything at all about himself or people. So, sometimes when you move out of the domain of order into the domain of chaos, everything falls apart on you. And that's a very common occurrence. And it's actually mapped mythologically. And part of the mythological mapping of that is encapsulated in stories of the descent into the underworld, where everything is shifting and chaotic. And you see this in all sorts of, the idea that we're skating on thin ice is a reflection of that. Stories like Jaws, the famous movie, that's another representation of that there's a surface where everything is calm and acceptable, but underneath that there's something terrible that lurks, and at any point it can pull you under. And Jaws is a retelling of Beowulf, which is a very old story, and that's a variant of really the oldest class of stories we have, which is something like encounter with a deep sea monster, successful encounter with a deep sea monster. And and that chaos and order dichotomy, that's very interesting because it turns out that your brain is adapted to that landscape, which is partly why I've become fascinated with Taoist world conceptions, because the Taoists, of course, believe in their famous symbol, yin and yang, they believe that the world is made out of, it's masculine and feminine, but the more fundamental translation is something like chaos and order. And that chaos can transform into order at any moment, hence the white dot in the black serpent, and that order can transform into chaos at any moment, hence the white dot or black dot in the white serpent. And the idea is that reality is this conjoined union of the unexpected and the predictable, and that out of that emerges meaning, and that Tao itself, which is the meaning that emerges out of that interaction, is also the same as the pathway of life, which implies that the appropriate pathway through life is to get the balance of chaos and order correct. And you might think, well, that's only metaphysical, but there's a problem with that presumption because it looks like your hemispheres, the hemispheres of your brain, are actually adapted such that the right hemisphere is fundamentally specialized for the encounter with the unknown, so for chaos, broadly speaking, and the left hemisphere is specialized, broadly speaking, for processing that which you've already encountered and mastered. And so then you think, well, if your brain, and not just your brain, but mammalian brains in general, have this bifurcated structure that reflects this underlying deeper reality of chaos and order, and your brain is a consequence of natural selection, and what selected you was nature, and nature is reality, then you start to have to wonder about whether or not the fundamental division between chaos and order is actually the most basic description of reality that we have. And I think that there's endless reason to believe that that's the case, that those are the highest order abstractions. And so in some sense, they represent the most permanent elements of reality. And you can map that chaos-order dichotomy onto, very usefully, to sort of expand your understanding of it. You can think of chaos as unexplored territory, and you can think of order as explored territory. And explored territory, well, that's where animals are comfortable. Some of you might have owned cats. You know, if you have a cat, you might notice that if you take the cat to a new house, it's generally a very unhappy cat. It'll just sit in a corner and yell often, especially if it's a timid cat, and then it'll sort of relax maybe after a day or two. Maybe it hides under the couch for the first day because it doesn't know what's going on, and it doesn't know where the things that might eat it could be lurking, and they could be lurking anywhere. So the cat's like a cat on a hot tin roof. And so it slowly thaws out as nothing particularly catastrophic actually happens, and then it starts to explore, and it'll map the house in detail, explore every nook and cranny. Once it does that, it'll start to calm down. That's very typical animal behavior. And one of the things that's interesting about that is that it actually indicates that our technical conceptions of anxiety are inverted, because a lot of the way that psychologists understand anxiety is as learned behavior. The presumption being that the typical creature, human being for that matter, is a sort of a calm creature, and that you have to expose them to punishment and then to something that signifies punishment in order to make them anxious. It's like, that's just backwards. The standard creature is terrified out of its skull. You put it somewhere new, and it's frozen with terror. And that's the normative approach to the world, because the world is a very, very dangerous place. And then it's only with great effort that you can build up a conceptual structure that indicates that your interactions with that foreign territory are unlikely to produce pain or frustration or disappointment or your demise. And so you build the structure that inhibits anxiety. It's like anxiety is the norm, and the fact that you aren't all paralyzed with anxiety all the time is generally only an indication that you don't go places where you can't predict the outcome of your behavior. Right? We like to stay in those places. And that's actually an unbelievably useful observation, because if you want to understand, for example, why people are attached to their cultural constructs so deeply, all you have to do is understand that as long as you associate with people who have the same structural narrative that you do and are acting that out, then you can predict your interactions with them, and all that earth-shaking existential angst remains under control. And so any threat to the integrity of that group agreement, which is a kind of game in some sense, and not an arbitrary game, but a game, any threat to the structure of that is a threat to the match between your expectations and the world that keeps your negative emotions in check. And, you know, an excess of negative emotion, that's not just unpleasant. The chronic exposure to an excess of negative emotion ages and kills you. Because what your body does when you confront chaos, when you confront the unexplored, especially when it happens accidentally, is put you into a state of emergency preparation. And that's very, very, very psychophysiologically demanding, right? Because let's say you don't know what's going to happen next. Maybe you walk down an alley and someone pulls a knife on you. You know, we tracked a bunch of people in Montreal with wearable psychophysiological monitoring devices, sometimes for days on end. And for an experiment that has nothing to do with what I'm telling you about. And one of them got robbed at gunpoint. And so we had the psychophysiological recording, and his heart rate was elevated above 148 beats a minute for 48 hours. Right. Well, I can tell you another story that's sort of like that. If you take rats and you put them in a naturalistic environment so that they can go about the rat business, raising their family and, interacting with their peers, they have a complex social life. And you have part of the environment a place where they used to feed, used to feeding safely. So they get accustomed to that, right? And usually in the dark, because rats are afraid of light like we're afraid of dark. And then you put the odor of a cat out there where they're accustomed to feeding, or a cat itself. Then the first rat that encounters the cat will do exactly what you would do if you saw a predator that was about the size of a Tyrannosaurus Rex in relationship to you. And so they run back to their burrows right away and poke their heads out, and then they scream for 48 hours ultrasonically. And that's about the same as you screaming for 2 weeks nonstop, if you calculate it across the span of a rat's life. So it's like, well, that's not a happy rat, that's for sure. And that's a rat with a heart rate that's elevated way above normal for 48 hours. And while that rat is screaming, all the other rats aren't like poking their noses out of their burrows. They're well hidden. And if nothing else happens that's negative during that 48-hour period, the rat will finally more or less calm down, and then as hunger takes over, the rats will slowly approach the place that was contaminated by the cat, and then they'll run back and forth really quickly across the area. They're called corner runs, and they hunch down so they're not evident to predators, and they'll remap the territory because they need to go forage and eat, and then the rats will all calm down and go back to their normal life. Well, that's what human beings are like too, except we don't see that terror because we almost never go where we shouldn't go, and we almost never allow our social structures to come unglued to the point where that depth of terror can grip us. But the idea that that's underneath everything, that lurking catastrophe. And so that's worthwhile knowing. So chaos is a place of lurking catastrophe. And why? Well, because you can be eaten. And human beings are strange creatures because we're definitely predators, but we're also prey animals. For a long time, they discovered this cat in Africa, very nasty sort of cat, fossilized cat, thank God, because this is the sort of cat we don't need. And it had a mouth, and it had one tooth on the bottom of its jaw, and it could open its jaw pretty much exactly the size of your head. And that's exactly what it did, and it hunted our primordial ancestors, and it would leap on them from the back, grab the front of their skull with its front teeth, and drive the one point through the back of their skull. And so that was life on the primordial plane, and that's not exactly pleasant. And so the idea that if you go out beyond the confines of your explored territory, that something predatory is likely to seize you is very deeply embedded in our psyche. And you can see this. You see this, for example, with the emergence of fear in children. Because very young children, before they're ambulatory, they don't really seem to experience anxiety. They can experience pain, and they can experience rage, but anxiety doesn't seem to mature the circuits until they can start moving. And that makes sense because anxiety freezes you, and if you can't move, there's no point in having a circuit that freezes you. But as soon as you can crawl or ambulate, then you can start to become afraid, and that's often when children start to become afraid of the dark. And you can tell your children, there's nothing to be afraid of in the dark. It's like, I don't know what planet you grew up on, but that's wrong. Right? I mean, there's plenty to be afraid of in the dark. And any child, any hyper-exploratory child in our ancestral history who lacked enough fear of the dark to wander too far away from the central campfire was a snack very, very quickly. And so there are terrible things that lurk in the dark. And that's a useful thing to know, because the notion that there are terrible things that lurk in the dark is the fundamental precognitive representation of chaos, of the unexpected itself, of the unknown itself. And that's as it should be, because what lurks where you're not the master is that which can destroy you. And so you see this, you see this in the most ancient stories of mankind. So you see this, for example, in the Mesopotamian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, which is the oldest written story that we have. There's an idea that reality itself emerges from the domain of a primordial monster. It's like, well, what's that domain? Well, the primordial monster lurks everywhere. I read a great book on dragons a while back because the dragon symbolism is distributed worldwide. And the person who wrote this book, and unfortunately I can't remember the name of the book, had this hypothesis, which I liked quite a lot, that the image of a dragon was actually the image of predator. You know, we think, well, there's no such thing as a dragon. There's a child's book by that name, by the way, which I did a lecture on. There's no such thing as a dragon. Well, okay, fair enough. What about predator? Is there such a thing as predator? And the answer is, well, obviously. Okay, well, a crocodile is a predator and so is a lion. How are they the same? A crocodile is a lizard and a lion is a mammal. It's like, well, you don't care because predators eat you. And that's the fundamental category. And there's no reason that we can't have images of predator. It's in all likelihood the case that the image of the predator predated the intellectual and articulated concept of the predator, since articulation follows long after the capacity for imagistic representation from a phylogenetic perspective. And so dragon is the category of predator, right? And why? Well, it's a snake, cat, tree, bird. And it also involves the capacity to generate fire. Well, what do you have for the class of great predators, for arboreal dwelling primate predecessors of human beings? Predatory birds, predatory cats, snakes, with whom we co-evolved, by the way. The evidence for that is quite clear. And then fire, and the fire can be an enemy in two sorts. One is, it's not a bad way of representing the bite of a poisonous snake, right? Something that can spit fire. And it's also not a bad way of representing fire, which if you happen to live in trees or even on the veldt is going to be a constant and mortal danger. Okay, so that's the dragon. You say, well, what's the fundamental representation of the chaos out of which order emerges? It's something like, well, it's the place of the predator. And that makes perfect sense. That's how you should treat it. But human beings, you see, we're not just prey animals. So we don't think, well, what's the best strategy with regards to the ever-present predator, the eternal predator, right? Because that's what we're concerned about. Because we can see the future. You know, you watch lions and zebras, they kind of coexist on the plain. And as long as the lions are sleeping, the zebras don't care. It's like the zebras don't get it. They don't understand that, like, crouching lion and sleeping lion are the same lion. And they're only afraid when the lions go into hunting mode. But human beings, we're not like that. As you see like a sleeping lion 30 feet away from your campground, you think, well, that's a problem because that lion's probably going to wake up and then it's going to be an awake lion. And so maybe we'll just sneak up on it now while it's asleep. So you think, well, that's what did human beings do in the face of the predatory unknown? Well, we decided that we would do everything we could not only to defend ourselves against the predator, but to defend ourselves against the concept of predation per se. And so, for example, if you're being threatened by, let's say, a group of predatory animals, a wolf pack or something like that, or a pride of lions, and you're living on the Serengeti, maybe you don't just hide and you don't just run and you don't use fire. You all get together one day in your dangerous veldt ape manner with your sticks and your spears, and you think, now we're going to take all those lions out, right? All of them. And we're going to go hunt. We're going to go hunt the predator itself. And so then the dragon story, which is part of the hero story, is precisely that. It's you go out into the unknown where the danger lurks, and you gain something of great consequence. You gain something of great value in consequence. And that's the fundamental human narrative. That's the hero story, essentially. And so, and it's a very sophisticated story because the story of predator becomes very, very sophisticated as we become more conceptually, as we become more conceptually sophisticated. Because the original predator might be animal, but the secondary predator might be foreigner, because there's no shortage of tribal warfare among our predecessors and even among us, for that matter. And so there's the human predator, and that might be the other, and that's why it's very easy to demonize the other, because you can easily throw the other into the category of serpentine predator, right? And that's demonization for all intents and purposes. And that's another level of abstraction, because the predator also becomes the human stranger, right? And And this is deeply rooted inside of us, by the way, because even chimpanzees, so chimpanzees are territorial, right? So they have a dominance hierarchy that marks out a territory. And the juveniles, the males, and sometimes females, but it's generally males, juvenile males, will patrol the borders. And if they find chimpanzees from other troops, especially if they outnumber them, chimps can't count, but they can estimate numeric advantage with small numbers. And so if there's 3 chimps on my side and 1 chimp on your side, it's like it's time to attack. And so chimps do that. They raid into the territory of other chimpanzees, and they're absolutely brutal about it. Absolutely brutal beyond imagination. Well, perhaps not beyond human imagination, because we can also be extraordinarily brutal. And that was discovered first by Jane Goodall back in the 1970s, and she was very ambivalent about that discovery. First of all, because it's a major discovery, right? That animals other than human beings actually conduct raiding parties into foreign territory. It really wreaks havoc on the notion that the reason that human beings are aggressive is a consequence of their socialization, right? And that we differ from animals somehow because culture has corrupted us into the warlike creatures that we are. It's like, no, afraid not. Our tribal ancestors were plenty warlike, and their precursors, the descendants, the animal that was our simultaneous ancestor, chimpanzees and human beings, were perfectly capable of primitive forms of warfare, and very brutally so. And we're also hunters. And chimpanzees, for example, like they'll hunt colobus monkeys, which weigh about 40 pounds, and they just tear them limb to limb and eat them alive. There's no sympathy whatsoever for the thing that they're preying upon. And it actually doesn't look like chimps even have much sympathy for one another when they're engaged in dominance disputes. And a lot of what regulates that seems to be the degree to which the rest of the chimps get upset. So, and it's hard to tell how much of that's also true of human beings. If you and I are having a fight in public, let's say, we don't know how much aggression might manifest itself. It could be up to the point of bloody murder and mayhem, and even worse than that. If we're around other people, the probability is very high that they're going to break it up because it agitates everyone else. And so it begs the question of how much the regulation of our own intrinsic emotion is actually a consequence of our embeddedness within a social community. It might be all of it. I read The Rape of Nanking, which I wouldn't recommend lightly, and it's an absolutely brutal book, and the woman who wrote it eventually committed suicide, and that's one good indication of exactly how brutal the book is. And it described what happened when the Japanese invaded China just prior to World War II. And in Nanking, there were basically brutality contests, and the people who were the most inventive at being the most brutal were the ones that everyone imitated. And so the notion that there was some intrinsic limit on the expression of human aggression certainly seems to be belied by the sorts of things that you saw in places like Nanking. So, superego be damned. It's hard to tell how much we're civilized because we stay around other people who constantly remind us to be civilized. And so now I think there's a bit more to it than that, but I wouldn't get too optimistic on that front. Anyways, the fundamental story, is a landscape of meaning. It's chaos and order. And in the chaos, there's something that's predatory, but it's also something predatory that holds great value. And so that's why, for example, in the classic stories, the subterranean predator, the dragon, let's say, hoards something of value. Gold sometimes, virgins sometimes. It's a very strange preoccupation for a gigantic, eternal, scaly reptile. But one of the things that we might point out immediately is that it's highly probable that those of your male ancestors that were particularly successful at attracting mates were pretty good at keeping the predators away from the women and the children. So, and it shouldn't take much imagination to draw the link between that imagistic representation and that actual reality. And human beings we're pretty good with clubs, and we're pretty good with our fists, and we're pretty good with spears, and we can really throw things, and we're good with bows, and we can fight viciously in groups, and we can take down things that are a lot bigger than we are. And that was carefully selected for over a very long period of time. And so the person who can engage in successful confrontation with the predator is likely to be a highly valued social being, partly among men, because I think this is how it worked during our evolutionary landscape. Women are sexually selective, hey? That's a very interesting thing about human females, because chimpanzee females are not. Now, dominant male chimps are more likely to leave offspring, but that's because they chase the subordinate chimps away from the females when they're in estrus. Not because the females won't mate with the subordinates, because they will. But human females aren't like that. They're very, very sexually selective. And so that's one of the theories about why we were driven over evolutionary history away from our co-ancestor with chimpanzees. There was human female sexual selectivity. And some of the evidence of that is that you have twice as many female ancestors as male ancestors. So the average probability of the reproductive success of a woman is twice that of a man. And that's female sexual selectivity. And so sexual selection is a major driving force in shaping who we are. And the consequence of that is a tremendous amount of rejection of men by women. But the consequence of that is, well, who we are. But it's more complicated than that. And I've been thinking about that a lot, because women are sexually selective in a very interesting way. If you look cross-culturally at female mate choice, what you see is that women tend to mate across and up hierarchies of competence or authority or power or socioeconomic status. Depends on how you define all that. But imagine that there's a hierarchy of men. There's a corresponding hierarchy of women. The women are attracted across and up, whereas the men are attracted across and down. And that seems true cross-culturally, by the way, although it's attenuated to some degree in more egalitarian countries. Now, in egalitarian countries, the personality differences between men and women actually get bigger. So the fact that what do they call it? There's a word for it, which I can't remember. It's that female preference for higher status males. It is attenuated somewhat in egalitarian countries, which indicates to some degree that it's driven by rational economic calculation, and that some of it's probably a biological predisposition. But what the male role in that is also extraordinarily interesting, because what males do is organize themselves into hierarchies. Now, females do too, but I'm going to leave that aside for the moment. Males organize themselves into hierarchies, and they vote up the male who's most competent to head the hierarchy. So now we're going to talk a little bit about hierarchies and their political significance. So you have this background of chaos, and chaos is symbolized, let's say, by the existence of the terrible possibility of predation and destruction, but also the promise that holds, that exploring that domain can bring something of great value. And so that's partly terror of the unknown, but also partly intense curiosity about what lies beyond the frontier. And both of those characterize human beings. And a lot of what motivates us is the tension between that apprehension and that excitement. And there are different neurochemical systems that mediate that. The dopaminergic system, which is the primary source of incentive reward, drives exploratory behavior. And the anxiety system, which basically runs on GABA, is the inhibitory system for exploration. And the exploration system is very old, by the way. It's not a cortical system. It's a deep subcortical system. It's actually hypothalamic. So exploration looks older than anxiety. It looks like it might even be older than pain. It's as old as hunger and thirst. It's a very primary motivation, as is defensive aggression. And fear regulates those, and for good reason. So, our basic psychological strategy is to be attracted by that which lies beyond the bounds of explored territory, and to approach the edge with apprehension, and then to play with extending what we understand into the unknown. And that's part of the pattern of the hero. Now, part of the way that we do that is collectively. So we're going to talk about hierarchies for a minute. So there's an idea that's very current in the West right now, which is a very bad idea, and it's a very weak idea, that the best way to characterize Western hierarchical structures is as patriarchal structures, first of all, and as tyrannically patriarchal structures. And two conclusions flow from that. One is that hierarchical structures are somehow undesirable intrinsically, that they're predicated on power, and that power is fundamentally an expression of male tyranny. And so I want to take all that apart, because it's fundamentally nonsense. It's actually the misapplication of a symbolic way of representing the world. And I'll get to that. So imagine this is we have problems. That's easy to imagine. Hunger is a problem, thirst is a problem, the need for shelter is a problem, the fact of scarce resources is a problem. we can all agree, because problems cause suffering, that we should do something about the fact that there are problems. And generally speaking, we can come to some consensual agreement about what the problems are, especially if we're all hungry, and we can come to some consensual agreement about what the solution might be. So if we're tribal and we're all hungry, hey, it might be time to send out a gathering expedition or to go on a hunt. And so let's say the men decide to go on a hunt and the women decide to go on a gathering expedition, which seems to be the standard distribution of sexual typed behavior under such circumstances. And so the men go on a hunt. Now, you got to organize yourself if you're going to hunt. You can't just do it chaotically. I mean, even lions organize themselves. So you're hungry. It's like, so who's going to lead the hunt? Well, if you don't want to die, then the person who's going to lead the hunt is going to be the best hunter. And one of you is going to be the best hunter out of 20. Or maybe, maybe there's a fight between two of you for the best hunter. I don't care. Because of the way that talent is distributed in the population, you're going to have a small minority of people in your group, whatever that group is, who are outstandingly good at one particular thing. And if you have any sense, then what you do is you organize your hierarchy so the person who has the highest level of competence is at the forefront of the hierarchy, and everyone else follows in line. And that's useful because, well, then you get to eat, but it's also useful because you get to watch the person who's the best, and with any luck, you get to learn how they're the best. Even if you're a lowly 13-year-old male and you're on your first hunt, you can at least shut the hell up and follow along and imitate and watch, and maybe you have some possibility of, at some point, ascending the hierarchy, assuming that everything goes well. So because we can imitate, it's not so bad that there's a hierarchy. And if you're going to organize social structures to pursue important goals, then you're inevitably going to produce a hierarchy. And the reason for that is that talent is unequally distributed. It's actually distributed according to a power law. And the power law is fundamentally that the square root of the number of people who are pursuing a given goal are responsible for half the productive activity. So if you have 10 men in your tribe, 3 of them do half the hunting. If you have 100 men in your tribe, then 10 of them do half the hunting. And if you have 1,000, then 30 of them do half the hunting. And it doesn't matter what you're hunting for. And that power law applies even, just so you know, it applies perfectly well to scientific publications. And that was laid out by a guy named de Sola Price in the 1960s. And it actually applies to any form of creative production. And much more than that, it also applies to the massive planets and the massive stellar bodies in general. A small proportion of stars have almost all the mass. It applies to cities. A small number of cities have almost all the population. There's something approximating a universal law that's often described as the Pareto distribution. And the consequence of the Pareto distribution, the unequal distribution of talent, is the inevitable construction of hierarchies. And the reason you construct them is, well, you want to organize yourself collectively to attain a valued goal. Now, what that means is that men are inclined in their hierarchies to allow the men who are best at whatever it is that's being pursued to occupy the top hierarchical positions. And the consequence of that is that they get the mating opportunities. And you think, well, that's a hell of a price for men to pay. And it certainly is, but it's probably better than starving to death. And then it also might be the case that it's not just hunting and eating that's going to preoccupy you, or tracking. It's also warfare. And so if you're going to war with another tribe, and you're going to do plenty of that if you live in an archaic society, because your chance of dying from homicide or intertribal warfare is unbelievably high compared to modern societies, is you're going to organize yourself behind the best leader. And the reason for that is, how about you don't want your enemies to kill all of you and take everything you have, because that's a very likely consequence of defeat. And so maybe you're willing to accept temporary subordinate status, even though to the winner go the spoils, because, well, it's a lot better than the alternative. And so it looks like human sexual selection is actually driven by 2 interesting factors simultaneously. One is the proclivity of men to rank each other in hierarchical competitions so that certain men rise to the top, and then the tendency of women to peel from the top. And so one of the things I think about that from a narrative perspective, from a mythological perspective, or even a religious perspective to some degree, is that I believe that part of the reason that we have the intuition that we were created in some sense by a paternal spirit is that the paternal spirit was actually, if you think about the paternal spirit as the collective action of the conscious decision of men across millennia, right? That's a pattern. And it's a pattern that has a certain persistence. Is that actually was a selection mechanism, and so I'm not precisely making a metaphysical claim because there might be a metaphysical correspondence between the idea of the creative patriarchal spirit and some metaphysical reality. But you can make a strong biological case for the construction of human beings as a consequence of the action of the patriarchal spirit across millennia. So you can think about that however you want, and if the idea is useful, well, that's fine. And if it's not, you're welcome to come up with an alternative hypothesis. Well, we should speak about this politically momentarily, I think. So let's assume for a moment that we do need to create hierarchies. And for the reasons I laid out, we have complex problems. They need to be solved. We have to organize ourselves. We want to put the competent people in charge of the hierarchy because the price is too high if we don't. So then we have a solution. The solution to the chaotic landscape is the construction of a hierarchy. It's like a pyramidal structure on the desert in some sense, right? And that's our solution. Organize ourselves into hierarchies of competence, keep the catastrophic forces of nature at bay. That's human social construction. All right, fine. Now we have a solution. The problem is that like all solutions, the solution of the hierarchy generates problems, and people knew that there was a problem with the hierarchy very, very long ago. They knew that the Egyptians, particularly the ancient Egyptians, they had a god, Osiris, who was the embodiment of the hierarchy. And Osiris had a variety of characteristics. So one of them was that he was a great hero when he was young. He was the establisher of the Egyptian state, but he got old and archaic and willfully blind. They insisted upon that, willful blindness. And he had an evil brother, Set. The word Set is transformed by the Egyptian Copts, the Christian Copts eventually, into the word Satan, just so you know. So Set is the evil brother of the king. And then the king always has an evil brother. It's a mythological trope. Just like there's a positive aspect to nature and a negative aspect, there's a positive aspect to the social world and a negative aspect. And the positive aspect can always be thrown over by the negative aspect. And the Egyptians, in their creation story, dramatized the idea that Set was always conspiring to overthrow Osiris, to cut him into pieces, to distribute his body across the kingdom, and that Osiris participated in that implicitly by remaining willfully blind. He could have known about the nature of his evil brother, but he chose not to. And that's a staggering discovery. So from so many thousands of years ago, for people to have understood that the spirit of a hierarchical structure is threatened by, well, Mircea Eliade laid this out quite nicely, by the fact that things deteriorate of their own accord across time. So if you put forward a solution to a problem, and you just don't change it for long enough, the solution will no longer work, because the landscape changes, right? So you have to adjust the damn solution to keep up with the changing landscape, or the solution drifts away from the landscape and becomes anachronistic, rigid, and malfunctioning of its own accord. Any of you who have businesses know this perfectly well. And it happens very rapidly in capitalist environments because, for example, the typical Fortune 500 company only lasts 30 years. Because you create something that works, but then the environment shifts on you, and you can't adjust the structure fast enough to keep up, and so the thing falls into pieces. And maybe then it's reborn as a set of smaller companies, or maybe people move on to other adventures, but well, that's exactly what happened in Egypt. And the reason was, well, two reasons identified by Eliade. One was things fall apart of their own accord. And the second is that the process by which things degenerated is sped by the willful blindness of individuals. Is sped up by the willful blindness of individuals. Brilliant. It's part of the conceptualization of something like sin. It's like your structure's going to fall apart. It's inevitable. How do you make sure it doesn't? You bloody well pay attention and keep it updated. You watch for when it deviates, you look for what's threatening it, and you take action at the appropriate time. Osiris failed to do that, so Set overcomes him, chops him into pieces, and spreads him out through the Egyptian community across the country. And so you can't kill him because he's a god, but chopping him up in pieces, it's a good start. And that means things fall apart, and they fall apart because of the spirit of willful blindness, maintaining its blindness in relationship to malevolence. And so the Egyptians figured that out, which is an absolutely brilliant innovation, religious innovation. So then what happens in Egypt is very interesting, is that, so Osiris is now fallen apart, but he has a wife, Isis. Isis is queen of the underworld. And so what does that mean, the underworld? Well, I told you about this guy who asked his girlfriend to marry him in front of all those people, and that didn't work. Well, he went into the underworld. To fall apart like that, right? To go, to lose your grip on what you understand and to fall down into chaos. That's a trip to the underworld. And so and the queen of the underworld, that's Isis. And she represents not only the terror of the underworld, the anxiety, that's part and parcel of the uncertainty that occurs when things fall apart, but she also represents the spirit of potential renewal. And so that's why, for example, in 12 Rules for Life, I point out that chaos is uncertainty and anomaly, but also the promise of new things. And that's part of why it's feminine. It's like, what's the defining characteristic of feminine? It's the source of new things. Right, and what you expect and can predict, that's not the source of new things, that's the source of what you can expect and predict. And the fact that the patriarchy is symbolized in modern feminist discourse by a masculine representation is indication that this underlying perceptual substrata is at work even in our political discourse. Now the problem with the characterization of our culture as a patriarchal tyranny is it's all evil king, and there's no wise king, and so that's not helpful. And there's no evil queen, which is also not helpful, because there's always an evil queen, just like there's an evil king. Anyways, Osiris falls apart, Isis comes up, queen of the underworld, and she searches across Egypt to find Osiris's phallus, and she makes herself pregnant. And what does that mean? Well, it means when things fall apart, there's the possibility that something new will be born. That's actually a story of the human condition. And it's really useful to understand this, because when you're moving forward in life and you attempt to maintain or transform the cognitive structures, the perceptual structures that protect you, now and then you're going to hit something. So sometimes something malevolent, sometimes your own malevolence, or sometimes someone else's, and it's going to shatter you into pieces. And everyone knows this because, well, sometimes it's tragedy. You get sick, or someone you love gets sick, and that tears you apart. Or sometimes you're betrayed at work. You've worked very hard for a promotion, and you trusted someone to work alongside of you, and they stab you in the back, and you're left with nothing. And your world falls apart. And people say that. Things fell apart. Isis makes herself pregnant. And she gets pregnant. She gives birth to Horus. And Horus is the Egyptian eye, right? A very famous symbol, everyone knows it. And Horus is also a falcon. And the characteristic of the eye is that it can see. So it's the thing that Osiris was missing, because he turned a blind eye. And the falcon can see everywhere. It flies above, and it's like the eyes of the king. The only thing that can see better than a human being is a predatory bird. And so the Egyptians used the predatory bird and the eye as the symbol of the capacity to pay attention. Horus grows up outside the kingdom, like we all do, because we're all alienated from the parts of our culture that are falling apart. We all grow up to some degree in the underworld because our culture isn't perfect. And when he grows up, he goes back to confront Seth, his evil uncle, and he has a terrible battle with him. And so they have a terrible battle, and unsurprisingly, because like Seth is the very symbol of the malevolent predator. And that's a terrible thing to encounter, especially if you're naive. Like if you're naive and you encounter true malevolence, it will damage you physically and psychologically. You better be prepared. And even Horus has a terrible time because he fights with Seth, and Seth tears out an eye. And that's the famous Egyptian eye. But Horus overcomes Seth and he gets his eye back. And then you think, well, the story should end. Horus puts his eye back in his head, and now he's king, right? The rightful son of the long-lost son of the rightful king has returned to establish peace and harmony. But that isn't what happens. What happens is that Horus goes back to the underworld, and he finds the ghost of Osiris in the underworld, lying there in a semi-animated state, dead for all intents and purposes, but being immortal, capable of being revivified, and he gives him his eye. And that revivifies Osiris, because now, instead of the old state being willfully blind and subject to disintegration by malevolence, it can see. And so then Horus and Osiris join arms, metaphorically, and they go back and rule the kingdom together. And so the Egyptians knew that the proper sovereign was the conjoined union of tradition and attention and vision. So that's the union of the living and the dead, and that's why the pharaoh was the live pharaoh and the dead pharaoh at the same time. And that became emblematic among the Egyptians of the eternal soul. It's unbelievably, metaphysically, theologically, unbelievably brilliant, and a tremendous solution to a complex problem, and also a moral burden. It's like, well, how do you stop the state from deteriorating? By waking the hell up, and by seeing what's in front of your face, and by confronting malevolence when it manifests itself in its nascent form. And one of the things I learned from studying totalitarianism, which I studied for a very long time, on the right and on the left, because I didn't really care where it came from, I just cared that it existed, is that, well, how did totalitarian states gain their hold and then move people towards the conduct of terrible atrocity? And the answer to that was individual citizens remained willfully blind. That's the reason, is that individuals abdicated their ethical responsibility and allowed things to slide sideways because it was easier to turn a blind eye. They lost their power of speech. They sacrificed that. That's the eternal logos, if you think about it from a mythological perspective. And they were not willing to see what was in front of them. And the consequence of that is the slow degeneration, or perhaps a fast degeneration, into something closely approximating hell. All right, so I'll close with, so the reason that I wrote Maps of Meaning in this book, and the reason that I'm going around talking to people, is because I determined, at least to my own satisfaction, 30 years ago, that we did have something to learn from the 20th century, from its totalitarian catastrophes on the right and the left. We're not supposed to forget, right? That's what we tell each other. Never forget. It's like, well, never forget what? What did you learn precisely? Because you can't remember what you don't understand. It's like, well, whose fault was it? You read about Nazi Germany, and you read about the Soviet Union, and you read about Maoist China, and you read history and you think, well, I was a victim or I was a hero, but you never think, oh no, I was a perpetrator. And that is what you should think, because if you read history properly, you don't just read it as a victim and a hero, you read it as a perpetrator. And you think, well, all right, if the same temptation emerged now in our cultures, what makes each of us think we wouldn't fall prey to exactly the same catastrophe? And the answer is, well, you would, in all likelihood. And then you might think, well, you don't want to. Perhaps you think that. Enough of that sort of hell. It's like, but then you better be awake, and you better say things truthfully. Because if you're asleep and you turn a blind eye and you say things that are false, then that's what beckons, and that's on you. And so I've been lecturing around the world. I've been going to talk to people around the world saying, well, what I've said to you tonight, and more, I mean, that some of the fundamental element of life is suffering, and it's contaminated by malevolence. And we need a deep meaning in order to be able to withstand that without having it corrupt us, because life is very difficult and bitter. And that deep meaning is to be found in something like the adoption of responsibility, heavy responsibility for your own well-being in the highest possible sense, for the well-being of your family, and for the stability and integrity of your community. And if you fail in that, not only do you fail to bring out what's best in you, and then fail at life, and suffer for that, because you certainly will, but the hole you leave in the structure of reality that could have been filled by what you could have been is going to be filled by something positively hellish, and that's on you. And that's a useful thing to know, because if you're going to buttress yourself against the catastrophe of existence with a meaningful goal, let's say, a meaningful set of responsibilities, then you actually have to understand that you have a canonical role to play. You know, and the idea in the West is that each individual is the sovereign pillar of the state, right? That's what we've decided. We took the old Egyptian idea of sovereignty and universalized it. It took thousands of years so that everybody became, in principle, the conjoined union of Osiris and Horus, the embodiment of tradition and the vision of life, right? That's the ideal person. And it's upon that ground that the idea of the state itself, a modern democratic state where everyone's equal before God and the law, is predicated on the idea that each of us are sovereign individuals. And that sovereignty carries with it a tremendous responsibility. And what's remarkable about that responsibility is that bearing that voluntarily is exactly the same thing as finding the most meaningful thing you can possibly do in life. And that sustains you psychologically against the suffering, but it also puts the world together. Because it works, like if you take on that responsibility. It's not just psychological. If you're there for yourself, you can put your life together. And there can be a lot less foolish suffering and malevolence associated with your conduct. And then if you can get your act together in some reasonable manner, then maybe you become someone that your family can rely on. Right? And then there's more people you can carry. That's a definition of strength. You know, we have this idea that the tyrannical patriarchy is only predicated on power, and that power is associated in some fundamental manner with the arbitrary exercise of tyrannical constraint. It's complete nonsense. Functional hierarchies are predicated on their ability to encapsulate and to utilize genuine strength. And genuine strength is the ability for you to rely on yourself and for other people to rely on you as well. And that's way more powerful than any casual utilization of tyrannical power. Those sorts of organizations are neither stable nor productive, as we know if we look at how dictators comport themselves around the world. And so the idea that our hierarchical structures, when they're healthy, are predicated on power is absolute bloody rubbish, and it's unbelievably dangerous. It's an offshoot of a particularly toxic form of resentful Marxism, and it's time for us to abandon that as a particularly bad theory, as it is a particularly bad theory, is that functional hierarchies are predicated on the integrity of the individual, and an individual with integrity is not only reliable for themselves and their extended self across time, which is a complicated thing, but they're capable of bearing many people along with them, and maybe the entire community. And you think, well, are we capable of doing that? And well, the basic answer to that is something like, well, what's the alternative? Perhaps we're not capable of doing that because it's a hell of a burden, period, and it's something to take on voluntarily. But the alternative, as far as I can tell, if you abdicate your responsibility, is that terrible things happen. And so that's the burden that's placed at your feet if you are, in fact, the sovereign entity upon which the state rests. It's like it's truly on you. You think, well, my life has no meaning. It's like, well, you're not looking very hard for the meaning, and maybe you're avoiding it because of its weight. You say, well, we should pursue happiness. That's an idea. Or we should pursue self-esteem or some transient idiocy of that sort. It's like, that's not going to sustain you through the storms of life. By no possible act of fate can you be sustained through tragedy and catastrophe by happiness. Obviously not. But you can be sustained by deep meaning, and you can find deep meaning in responsibility. And so you take that responsibility on as much as you possibly can, and then you stumble uphill with it. And that stabilizes the hierarchies and keeps them healthy as long as you're alert. And then that keeps the catastrophes at bay. And that makes everything stack up properly. And so that's why in the West, you see, we figured this out a long time ago, over many thousands of years. We've been concentrating on the notion that the fundamental unit of redemption is the individual. That's the right level of analysis. And then in order to put society straight, what you do is you concentrate on the redemption of the individual. Each soul, let's say, has to be saved, if you want to use religious language, because it is the case in some strange metaphysical manner that each of us is the center of the world, and that we bear the weight of being that center. We participate in the process with our consciousness of bringing new things into being, right? You confront potential. When you wake up every day, you see what might lay itself out in the world, and you make the choices that make that possibility into actuality. And the actuality that you produce is a consequence of the ethical integrity of your choices. You take the possibility of the world, the chaotic possibility. That's what you deal with all the time, and you make that into reality. And if you do it with truth, then you make a reality that's habitable and good. And if you do it with deceit, then you generate something that approximates hell. And that's what an individual is. That's how consciousness works. And that's tied into the deepest stories that we have. And they're true. Thank you very much.